admit another. And my suggestion is to leave the floor to Donatella and we close after I speak, I shut my video. And I suggest you all to shut your video too, so she can speak and have completely the online floor. And first of all, I want to thank again Donatella Geoffrey today to be here and accept our invitation. And I want to say some word to present Donatella Della Porta that she is very known in the world as social science in social movement, as she don't need the presentation. But just few words, I want to recall that she is professor of political science, dean of the Faculty of Political and Social Science, and director of the PhD program in Political Science and Sociology at the Scuola Normale Superiore in Florence, where she also leads the Center on Social Movement Studies, very known to Cosmos. She has directed a major ERC project Mobilizing for Democracy on civil society participation in democratization process in Europe, the Middle East, Asia and Latin American. And I want to say you all that she present a speech on social movement in critical junctures, mobilizing in pandemic times. So, Donatella, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you all for this kind invitation. Unfortunately, not in person. Do better next time. And I want, in fact, to address in this 20 minutes keynote questions that have already been mentioned in the presentation of the conference. One is how Liana said, how to analyze social movements in the pandemic. So which type of changes do we have to introduce in our theoretical models and in our empirical tools? And the second question is what we notice is that there have been during the pandemic many movements. Some were the good movements that Barry mentioned, like the Black Lives Matter movements that developed exactly at the end of the first lockdown. But there were also movements that challenged solidarity. And in this presentation, I want to refer to research that we are doing at the Cosmos, the Center on Social Movement Studies, on both the progressive movements and what I considered as regressive movements, based on research on movements for care, solidarity movement, Black Lives Matter on the one hand, but also the anti-vax on the others. So first questions that I want to address, as you can see in the first, in this slide, the introductions to especially issues of interface already noted about a year ago, or even more, that pandemic times are movement times, to a certain extent against the odds, because we expected that lockdown would produce a closing down of the public spaces that are necessary for movements to move. But what we saw is what the introductions to these special issues define a world in fire with both fever and flame. So, as you can see in the next slide, but as you have seen in many of the coverage and the media the media coverage of the pandemics, the pandemic has been a time of protest on health issues that represented a sort of core concern and a bridging phrase, but also on labor issues, on environmental issues, on issues of democracy in general. And in the next slide, I think first questions that we have to reflect upon is there are times of movements, there are pandemic times. The pandemic has been defined as a global moment with a sort of unique characteristics. And of course, it is not the first pandemic, but it is the first pandemic to develop under some circumstances. So where can we look in social movement studies for indications about the type of times we are living in? And when I started to work on this topic, I was already interested in another term that Barry mentioned earlier on, momentum. So what happens in this period is that times is very accelerated, and we live in moment not of slow transformations, but in moment that new institutionalist scholars have called critical junctures. And the characteristic of a critical junctures is speed and deep transformations. Of course, this is challenging terms. So to which extent our times are critical in the sense that they will produce big changes is an open question. But for sure, they have already, pandemic times, changed the context in which social movements have acted through creating new grievances, accentuating the grievances that were already there, but also to transform the organizational setting, the ways in which protest was performed. They are also moments of crisis. They are not the first moment. So I think it is important to consider that the pandemic times crisis arrived after several other crises that movement had addressed in the past, from the financial crisis of the turn of the years 2010 to the climate crisis to the health crisis. There are a lot of continuities also because one crisis was not yet over when the pandemic times developed. There are also times of emergency. So this means different things in different theoretical approach. Emergency times have consequences in the ways in which policies are made. There are times in which not only there is a high speed of decision making, but there is also less transparency, and there is a pretense that there is no choice. But in reality, the choices which are made in emergency times are many and are characterized by low degree of accountability. Of course, the crisis has been also a crisis in which trade-off between different rights and trade-off between rights and freedom have been broadly addressed and discussed. I think it is also important to consider that this is a critical junctures during an emergency crisis that is related with the contagious disease. And I started to study also movements that developed around health issues, and in particular movements that developed around the epidemics or pandemics. And what several scholars had observed was the importance of the cognitive conflicts around how to define a pandemic. So previous epidemics, or sometimes called pandemics, is the AIDS pandemic, and it has attracted a lot of attention in social movement studies because also of the mobilizations of the gay movements, being AIDS defined as a gay disease in the beginning. What I studied and what a lot of scholars told us studying the ways in which disease affect conditions is that plagues, epidemics have been important in transforming the world. And they have been important in different ways. They have been also important sometimes in acting like wars, in pushing for the constructions of different struggles, and also the development of different rights. So the Spanish flu at the end of the First World War was called the pandemic that has produced the public health system interacting with the movement of reform of the health system that was already active. These are also, and this is the point I want to make, eventful time. So they are times in which also protests develop in different ways than in normal time. For instance, in the case of the Black Lives Matter, what we saw was the capacity of an event to trigger global ways. This was related for sure with the type of technologies, but was also related with a particular sense of living in a dramatic moment in which the pandemic has increased and made more visible the killing fields of the spreading of the virus itself. So if you can go to the next slide. What I tried to reflect upon based on research on how progressive movement mobilize is some transformations in the forms of actions, the organizational structures, and on the one hand, forms of action that characterize but also, the PowerPoint is gone, but I can continue. It's back. Is characterized by innovative forms of protest, so from the distanced protest that took place also in several countries during the Black Lives Matter, to the development of new forms of protest online that to a certain extent remain part of the repertoires of actions also nowadays. But this is only part of what progressive social movements did, because what we saw immediately was the mobilizations of social movements in what some scholars have called direct social actions, other scholars have called self-help, forms of new mutualism that I think produced important transformations in the ways in which problems were addressed. And something that is at the very core of this conference, I think it is also important, the perceptions that many social movement organizations have that's given a challenge to everyday life. What was also important was to develop knowledge about the pandemic, but also developing knowledge about how different states reacted to the pandemic, also through forms of repression, and developing knowledge about some core questions related with public health, from the inequalities, especially strong in some countries, to the issues of the patents on vaccinations that once again became a very central point. In terms of organizational structures, what I noted in this research was the presence of decentralized emergent group that were very localized. So that's developed in the neighborhood. People were locked down. They started to make contact through balconies, but then they also started to organize in the very neighborhood, mobilizing neighborhood relationship, and social movement organizations remobilized. And what was interesting was the capacity of networking, and this networking started out of need, because what most activists told us is we perceived that we had to do something, not just talking about something. And first help was also in providing food to the people who could not shelter at home because they had no home, or mobilizations of the workers that were forced to continue to work, and so on. Networking started initially out of necessity, but there was also a broadening of participations of those who were more directly affected. So I think it would be important to continue to study the post-pandemic effect in terms of the capacity of resilience of some of these networking that also brought together very different parts of the population. As I mentioned, initially out of need, and then out also of normative support for the idea of building horizontal ties between different groups. And in terms of collective frames, what I noted in this research is the frame bridging around public health that became a core frame of issues and groups already mobilized on social inequalities, climate, labor rights, violence on women, and so on. And here the developments of some frames that had been developed already in previous type of mobilizations, but which acquired new meanings during the pandemic, like the idea of the commons, the idea of intersectionality, and especially the idea of care and caring. So if you go in the next slide, Camillo, I think that's what all these mobilizations and also the Black Lives Matter mobilization has shown is the presence of some opportunities in emergency critical junctures. So there was a development of solidarities within communities at local level, but then networking. And this, scholar says, is also part of the normal reactions to catastrophes. That's not only, can I say, trigger competitions, but also mobilize solidarities that very often is already there. There is an innovations in communication channels that has a deep and broad impact on movements that we are studying. And what several movement activists stressed was the opening of discursive opportunities. Very often, the perspective was not so positive. So many of our activists stress the point that the pandemic was a lost opportunity in several cases. but still it triggered an attention to the importance of public interventions and to the importance of public interventions in different ways. So we can move quickly to the next slides. Black Lives Matter traveling from the United States to Europe also brought about mobilizations of groups that had not yet mobilized. For instance, in Italy, especially second generations of people of colors, young people that claim different conceptions of solidarities. And in the next slide, results of a protest event analysis tells us that what this protest that started in a very almost spontaneous way brought about was a remobilization of many groups, from political parties and trade unions to pre-existing migrant and anti-racist groups, social center, LGBTQ, student organizations, feminist organizations, environmental organizations, second generations of migrants. So what we found is eventful protest that spreads on the basis of also the presence of a supporting environment. And if you can go to the next slide, please, Camillo. I think what is important to notice is that faced to the, let's say, the challenge, the deep challenge of the pandemic, an intersectional type of approach tended to emerge. So some issues became broker issues around which alliances were built. And the resonance of these events and of the eventful protest was often accentuated by the fact that the pandemic had brought about the perceptions that we need a global response. So in the next slide, also I want to point at the challenges, however, that in emergency critical junctures we found. And we are studying the anti-vax protest. And I think the anti-vax protests, to a certain extent, of course, are embedded in the same type of events and context, but they represent sort of opposite type of reactions. While in the progressive movement, solidarity prevailed, in the anti-vax protest, at least in the countries I'm studying, in Italy, in Germany, and in Southern Europe, more in general, most of the anti-vax protests were reflecting reactions to the virus that was rather connected with scapegoating and with forms of isolations and fragmentations. And in the next slide, I think there is a mic that is open. I hear noises, but anyhow, what I considered as a regressive movement in pandemic times. Anti-vax protests were in their forms of actions also quite decentralized, but the forms of actions were also characterized by radicalization since the very beginning, and the organizations of also moments of spreading of fake news and different type of radicalization process. From the point of view of the organizational structures, there was a proliferation of groups that came from different type of previous existing networks, from previous way of anti-vaccination movement to the Christian rights and neoconservative groups that especially financed from the United States to Europe this type of protest. Anti-European Union groups of what in Italy is called sovereignist type, so very exclusive forms of identity, and exoteric groups of different types. And a characteristics within this type of protest was a visible and very tough form of competition. In terms of collective frames, what I noticed in this research was especially the imports in Europe of QAnon type of conspiracies that tended to bridge different type of conspiracy belief with the traditional attack on Jewish people, but also the idea of a big conspiracy of small elites against the majority of the populations, the idea of a great reset, the idea of great transformations in the demographic and vaccinations considered as also an instrument to transform the DNA of entire populations. Individualism and sectarianism is, I think, characteristics of these collective frames. So moving quickly towards the end, also protest event analysis of different wave of anti-vax protest in Italy. What can be noted is a lack of capacity of these groups to produce type of connections with broad existing movements and organizations. And in fact, the common core message that you can find in the next slide is characterized more by very individualistic type of frames, also the open participations of the radical right, but also the attempt to present these tiny mobilized groups as the modern contemporary form of extreme repression and reference to the Holocaust that have been pointed at in many cases. And in the next slide, I wanted to point at the fact that the core denunciations was the sanitary dictatorship, the technocratic dictatorship, with the denial type of positions, denial of the importance of the virus and the danger of the virus, but also the denial of the potential advantages of vaccinations. And in the next slides, you can see that especially in the European case, these have been connected with right-wing populist denunciations of global elites and very exclusive forms of nationalism. So the idea of a great reset and of a few a small elite that is able to control the development in the entire world through developing a sort of deep control of the individuals. So if we go to the next slide, I can conclude here. I think that's what would be interesting to continue doing is comparing different types of movements, the progressive and the regressive. They have some similar characteristics that I think are to a certain extent related also with the very limitations that the pandemic brought about. So they are quite localized. They at the level of actions. They are decentralized at the organizational level, and they point at the existence of an emergency. But then both the practices and the frames tend to change. On the progressive side, we still see development of collective forms of actions. So if we take the analysis of especially communications in social movements, what we see is that there is a strong capacity through the use of the social media to spread protest, but that this is also embedded in an existing network and of collective actions. There is a capacity for networking, even if with time one could also point at the difficulties that have been pointed at in also in developing this task. And the frames are building upon the traditional frames of solidarity and care and intersectionality that have developed in progressive movement. On the regressive side, we see in the research we are developing that instead the type of protest developed very much through the use of social movements with much less capacity of mobilizing existing groups. So they are also characterized by a quick spread, but very, very quick disappearance. The organizational model is an attempt to crowdsource through the use of the internet, the mobilizations of different type of actors, which however failed face to the type of people also who are mobilized and the lack of experiences and resources for collective actions. And the framing is on the opposite side, a frame of selfishness and individual freedom. How these movements will develop is, I think, an important issue, and I'm looking forward to discuss this in the continuation of this conference. Thank you very much. So yes, I will stop here. The very last, I tried to stress this point of how social movement develops within critical junctures and the type also of implications it has for our analysis, which is not to forget about the contextual constraints, but also consider very much the contingent and emerging characteristics of these times. Thank you, and looking forward to listen to Jeffrey.
So thank you so much, Donatella. Just few for your speech. Just few comments before give the floor to Geoffrey. And I perfectly agree that pandemic times has been also movement times, and in particular there were the relevant turning point for environmental justice and environmental movement, in my opinion. I want also to emphasize that even even if pandemic open to very critical, as you said, times and issue, it also takes to new trends of solidarity that involve also social movement. I very thanks you for giving us a very broad analysis about change, innovation and opportunity in social movement during and after pandemic. It's like a treasure that we can develop. So thank you so much again. So before giving the floor to Geoffrey, that ISA people know very well because he's one of our ISA Vice President, I want to present him. He is a Fond National de la Recherche Scientifique, researcher and professor at the Catholic University of Louvain, Belgium. He is currently, I said, the International Sociological Association Vice President for Research. He holds a PhD in sociology from the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales à Paris, and chair the research program Social Movement in the Global Age at the University of Louvain and at the College of the College d'Études Mondiales in Paris. His research focuses, we know, on social movement, young activists, ecology, critical consumption, democracy and globalization. And his main books are Alter Globalization, Becoming Actors in the Global Age, and Movimientos Sociales on el siglos XXI. I don't know in Spanish, sorry. And I want to present the title of your speech, that is social movements during the pandemic, solidarity, cosmovision, and social change. So, Geoffrey, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Liana. I'm so glad to join you in this conference, and I would really like to thank Liana, Camilo, Tova, Benjamin, Natalia, and all the other organizers of this conference, not only to open this space in the ISA to share reflections at a very timely period, but also to point out to some very important question that I think that the call that you made for this conference was really, really good, and try to share my screen. Can you see it now?
Yes, Ben. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. So I've taken actually I've focused on two of the questions that the conference organizers raised. What are the intellectual challenges that the COVID-19 pandemic is bringing to social movements scholarship? And is it time now to reinvent the future? This is a really key question, and of course I'll take the opportunity to discuss it based on a book that we coordinated with Brian and Wingel, and this is just out, so it has been published just 3 or 4 days ago this week, and it's in open access on the Bristol University Press website. So what we try to do with Brian in this book is to bring together authors from very different contexts and countries. 46 authors, including, of course, Donatella Laporta, and from 5 continents. What is important here is that if we want to look at the pandemic and learn some lessons, I think that it's important to see the pandemic not only from the West, but also from the global South and from different cultural, geographical, and social environments. What I would like to stress here is that when we see the movement from different realities, also in the North, from different countries, it has also an impact on the way we see the world and we analyze the pandemic. So this is why it was really important to bring together these authors, first to document the period of time that will remain specific in our century, but also to point to some lessons. And here I think that Donatella's talk was very important too, because we have to take the lessons of this pandemic also to address other crises, particularly today the climate change, but also the crisis that comes from the war in Ukraine. So what kind of lessons may we take about all of it if we follow the question raised by the conference organizers? I think that the first two are very obvious for social movement scholars, but not for many intellectuals outside of our field, and that's why I think we have to stress that. The first point, is that the connection between the crisis, any crisis, and social change is not so obvious and straightforward. Today, in 2022, it is once more clear that a crisis in itself does not produce a specific social change. The change depends on the actors, on social movements notably, and on the way they interpret the crisis. And they impose it over other actors' interpretations. This is a very important lesson, including at the time when we face climate change. And of course, there were many illusions 2 years ago, particularly. The post-pandemic world will be fairer, greener, more democratic. Well, we see today it is not the case. 2 years ago, there were hundreds of op-ed opinion articles written by dozens of intellectuals. They maintained that the pandemic would be the end of capitalism, would open to a brand new world, that we would all enact different relationships. Today we already knew as social movement scholars, but today everyone knows that these were mostly wishful thinking. So, and which brings me to the second point. Of course, when we talk about social movements in the pandemic or in any period of time, we should not focus only on the movement we like, on progressive movements, and this is what Donatella just explained, so I will not develop it more. Just to say that these movements are active, of course, in politics and in public spheres, but also in private life. Private life, including religious movements that are far more important than we thought, I think. And also the fact that, for me, what is still a surprise, that this movement seems untouched by reality, by the virus. There's no fact check for many of these movements, and they will always reinterpret the crisis, the pandemic, in their own way. So I had a few slides on religious movements. I will skip because Donatella already talked very well about that. And notably, I would just like to insist on the importance of religion in these movements. That's a point that maybe deserve more attention. But then, to come back to the first question, from the pandemic to social change, how does it work? What do we know today? Everyone knows that there is no predetermined outcome of a crisis. The way the humanity will emerge from the COVID-19 pandemic will depend on vaccine, of course, on the distribution, but also on the ongoing struggle of the social, political, and geopolitical significance of the pandemic, which is why, 2 years ago, I wrote an article entitled "The Pandemic is a Battlefield." And this is still the case. The meaning of the pandemic is still a space of the battlefield, and I will not go too deep into Gramsci, but it is definitely a battle for the ideological hegemony over the pandemic and the world that will come out of it. But then what is interesting here is that it means that narratives are really important, and this is something where this is a space, narratives, battle over narratives, that's a key function, a key role of social movements. So we have seen many intellectuals with huge narratives. There were many narratives saying, oh, capitalism will be over, or we will go to a totally authoritarian world, big narratives. And in the book, we have also Arturo Escobar, great Colombian anthropologist. He explained that it is crucial at this stage, he writes during the first year of the pandemic, that movements have narratives ready about other ways of living, and that these narratives are ready. So we need narratives. Of course, but the question we may raise today is which kind of narratives? Because these were huge narratives, very massive ones. And I think here we should take the word by Donatella Porta and Montserrat Sagot in the same book. Social movements organizations help us to imagine future scenarios, to create and recreate ties. And Montserrat Sagot had a really very important sentence here. More than a fantasy of the future, we must pay attention to what is in fact there, the proposals and practices that emerge, what people are concretely doing and inventing, what is happening here and now around us and among us. So here what I would say, we're thinking about all these problems with some more, after some more time. Definitely, these huge narratives were very often disconnected from the change. While various sociologists, many authors of this book invite us to have a closer look at what was happening, what is happening in the grassroots, which is really a key function of social movements and, of course, of activists. In various texts and also of the book, and also in some of my own articles, we insist on the importance of solidarity practices. That solidarity is not, as it is written in some social movement literature, a side effect of social movements or an effect of its institutionalization. It is really something that's fundamental in social movements today, and it has always been. Look back at Hobsbawm, for instance, in the making of the English working class. And it's important here. It's not only that it saved many lives, but also it helped us to bring different perspective on the world. The importance of mutual aid is also that it brings people to see the state differently, for instance. Pre-politics, it's already political, of course, and we have seen many movements that move from grassroots initiatives to protest and backward. So that's important, and I would say in terms of social movement studies, it is also an invitation for us to build or to consolidate bridges between social movement studies and other fields, including civil society from below, associations, civic life, all these voluntaries. This is also, we have to avoid to separate this field and to see what's happening below the tip of the iceberg, below the protest, below the most visible part of social movements. And I would also say that solidarity economy is also very important here. It's in the book, we have two articles from very different contexts, from Rio de Janeiro and from India, South India, by Ashish Kothari. And every time you go, you see alternative on the local scale, you see that the economic dimension is also very important, because you cannot only give some soap and gel and then afterwards vaccines to people. You also have to provide them some work and some money so that they can just buy food. So solidarity economy and social movement, that's a really interesting debate, cross-fertilizations that has been opened, that has been strengthened during the pandemic. And actually what is interesting here is that seeing from the global south, there is no gap, there's no, they don't see social movements and voluntary community or solidarity economy as separate fields. That's maybe something that we in the North have done to separate, to split social movement studies with solidarity economy and voluntary associations. So that's one of the things we may learn from our colleagues from the Global South. I also then developed it in this book. Well, I have a slide also on indigenous community that we skip. Basically, in terms of social movement studies, it could be an opportunity to reconnect daily life, solidarity, and social movements, protests, and the other mainstream dimension of social movements, to reconnect organizing inside movements and political protests, to reconnect alternatives in practice and alternative visions of the world. And here, what was really interesting for me is to read and to talk with, for instance, women who organized solidarity kitchen in neighborhoods. Well, sometimes we may think that in a movement there are people who act, who do these grassroots initiatives, and other people who strategize, who think the movement of the world. That's a mistake. People who act very locally in a grassroots, they also develop different visions of the world. It's just that very often these visions of the world are not that visible. They don't write so much about it. But it's not, we should not separate those who act locally and those who think the movements are the alternatives. And that's the third and final lesson here, is the importance of social movements as producers of knowledge. Again, nothing new, but I think this is even more important. It has been more important during the pandemic. The collective struggles on different scales, level. And social movement been successful because social movements have changed the way we see the pandemic today. It seems obvious today, but 2 years ago, people thought that everyone could be infected by the pandemic in the same way. It's a virus, it's biology. But then social movements, actors show that it is a deeply unequal pandemic. They worked on this data gap, the fact that there are plenty of data on some part of the city, on some countries about the COVID, but very few on the edges, countries, poor neighborhoods. In India, the media told that there were no problems of COVID in the poorer states of India. Likewise, in the article, with two articles on data gap, notably in Rio de Janeiro, in some favela of Rio, which is also part of the article on the pandemic as a battlefield. It was very interesting to see how the actors who first distributed food and during the COVID and tried to prevent the COVID diffusion in the favela, they very soon also started to collect their own data, because what the city government was showing is that there were no problems of COVID in the poor neighborhoods. But of course there were problems. The fact is that these cases, COVID cases, were not even counted in the national statistics of Brazil. So what was interesting to see how movements produced data from this popular neighborhood to visibilize what was invisibilized by the health system and national statistics. So that's something that was really interesting during the pandemic. But the cognitive struggle goes beyond statistics and this data. It's also about producing different perspectives of the world. And the pandemic, of course, made visible many hidden debates and issues. Inequalities didn't arise with the pandemic, but they were amplified by the pandemic. What is also interesting is this connection between concrete experience of the pandemic and then that becomes abstract knowledge. We have to see the pandemic from different perspectives, from different experience, notably from the global south, to understand it. And just to go quickly toward the end, another layer of this cognitive struggle is also the layer of alternative epistemologies, epistemologic activism. And in the book, we have two sections about it, but mostly one called Critical Thinking and Emerging Theoretical Challenges. It's very interesting to see how, with the pandemic, some different way of seeing the world, some different alternative epistemologies that once again are not new, but became more important, more widely diffused during the pandemic. It's about care, of course, feminist perspective, intersectionality, but also the logic of reciprocity. And here I would like to take back an old sentence that I like to quote by Luis Maca, a female leader of the CONAIE, an indigenous movement in Ecuador. She said, "Our struggle is social and epistemic." I think we cannot understand today movements if we don't connect very closely these two aspects, social and epistemic. The way we see the world is part of this struggle. And this is what happened during the pandemic too, the way we see the pandemic and the way we see the world during the pandemic. And out of some of these practices, new paradigm are emerging. For instance, commonality. This ideas of practice, but also worldview that is rooted in an experience, to quote Gustavo Esteva, in an art of living together centered on a sense of commonality, which is anchored in the lived experience of indigenous communities and is at the same time the object and meaning of the struggle. What is interesting today also that we start to see new books coming out in sociology with this new paradigm. For instance, I developed all this point in an article in a book edited by Silvia Cataldi and Gennaro Iorio, entitled "Social Love and the Critical Potential of People." Social love, that's an interesting paradigm to look at for social movements. What was interesting during the pandemic also is to see how all these different layers were articulated. Feminist movements, for instance, they started by being a self-help group, opening shelters for victims of gender violence. Then for there, they started to try to bridge the data gap. They made statistics and show that how many women were victims of domestic violence during the lockdown. this had an impact on policies. But then after that, they also showed that women were not only victims, they were also actors in the pandemic, and then they came up with various, they contributed to alternative epistemologies. So there is a connection between concrete practices of solidarity and policy changes and the alternative epistemology. Well, skip that to go to the conclusion then. Well, 5 brief conclusion more to open the discussion here at the beginning of this important conference. First one, the social movements reconfigure themselves during the pandemic. That's a sentence by Sabrina Sayak in the book. It's true, but what about social movement studies? Probably that we also we have started to reconfigure our field in the pandemic. Seeing social movements, that's the second point, also below the tip of the iceberg. The importance of solidarity is acknowledged by everyone in the field today. It was maybe not so much the case before the pandemic. And this importance of articulating concrete practices and critical perspective, contentious and alternative practices and production of knowledge. And then this leads me to the first point, the importance of this social change, of these alternatives on the local scale. It's really important. We probably need to have more intellectual modesty in proclaiming the historic changes, that the fact that everything will change after a crisis, which actually very few social movement scholars said, but other sociologists for sure. The importance of observing grassroots initiatives. At the same time, there's still a challenge here. How important are grassroots initiatives? Very important. But does it change the country policies? In the UK, you had over 4,000 COVID mutual aid local groups. And has the country become more progressive, more solidaristic? That's still a question. How do these alternatives connect with national and maybe global scale? And finally, my final point is that we need more global dialogue, and we as scholars, mostly from the global north, for what I could see in the audience, we have many things to learn from actors and sociologists from the global south, notably on social movement, but also just before, because the crisis that we saw as very exceptional, the pandemic, well, in the global south, this is the kind of crisis they have to deal with on a very much more regular basis, which is why we need more dialogue between sociologists, researchers, but also actors from the global north and from the global south. And with that, I end my talk here. Thank you.
Okay. So thank you, Geoffrey, for your speech. Just few comments before give the floor to the comment and question. I found your 3 main lesson a very fitted point of view, and also I agree with you that pandemic make relevant the fight for a greener world. Was a chance for social practice in social movement that I find is right. They are at the core of social movement, but it registers also a new rise of diffuse authoritarianism. And also I agree with you that on the one of the last slide about the social movement as producer of knowledge. Yes, I think that they produce knowledge particularly on global and environmental justice, and in make visible inequality and relevant issue. And so thank you so much to you and Donatella Della Porta for this very useful speech and contribution. Now, if someone wants to contribute with some comment, question, something else, please. No comment? Yes. Please, Sahu.
So who can you just open the microphone to listen your intervention, please?
Unmute me. I can't.
Sorry, Sahu, I cannot mount you. You have to click on the microphone icon to the right, in the top right, or if you want to write your question on the chat box, and maybe we can.
Some other comment, question? Waiting for Sahu.
Well, I just want to I just have a question for Donatella Jeffrey at the same. And it's because both interventions are highlighting that we need to do a dialogue with different kind of, I don't know, epistemologies, different kind of new theories in order to understand what is happening and what happened during the pandemic. So I was just wondering if you both can explain more about how we can create these kind of bridges or links with other kind of epistemologies, other kind of disciplines, in order to create a new perspective to address the challenges that we are facing. So if you can just explain a little bit more about that, I would really appreciate. Thank you.
Please.
I was thinking, and if you saw my presentation and Jeffrey were really on the same page.
Yeah.
When I thought about the broadening also of interactions with the other perspectives, I was thinking about processes of hybridization that are also at play. So what I notice is that people working on civil society and associations have more and more of an interest in social movement studies because their association are changing forms. So there's been criminalizations also of very, let's say, established civil society organizations. So they even need to understand how social movements developed. And I noticed that also scholars in these areas invite social movement scholars because they perceive that their own organizations are changing. Think about also unionism, that for a while, especially in the global north or in the north, it's become quite specialized on the industrial relations. Now, more and more, you see that in several areas in which the most precarious forms of work and high exploitation, social movement unionism is developing. Already when studying the responses to the austerity crisis, issues of solidarity economy developed with the development of type of organizations like the social clinics in Greece that were sort of hybrids. So I think that this is important for us to understand, because hybrid means that not only some groups go more in the directions of social movement repertoires, networking, and so on, but also that in order to understand this group, in order to understand these practices of solidarity, in order to understand the knowledge politics of the group, we have also to talk and to introduce visions from this other perspective. And I also agree very much with Jeff that solidarity in terms of actual practices is nothing new. We have the long established traditions of the labor movement, the feminist groups, the environmental groups, and so on. I think that what is interesting is the specific type of growth of this type of activities that reacts on the one hand to the declining capacity of the states and willingness of the states to provide for support, welfare, and so on, but on the other hand also by perceptions that we have also to do politics in other ways, and that these practices are also needed faced to a very fragmented world in order to reconstitute the spaces for the development of solidarity.
I think there is a comment of Lydia Loschiavo in the chat. Lydia, would you like to say by yourself?
That's okay. Thank you very much. I was just underlining
these
perspectives that have been illustrated, but just I recall in my mind this perspective developed by Manuel Castella. I think in the first one of his books about globalization, when he said that movements in the millennium would have been both progressive and on one side and regressive on the other one. And also I appreciate so much this perspective, to highlight the contribution of grassroots organizations, but also to keep a sort of modesty, in our approach to this analysis, because yes, the pandemic is a battlefield, and this means that both the dystopian and utopian view of the society of the future are present in society at the moment. And also I appreciate so much this perspective on alternative epistemic views of the world and of the future. And I would like, I have chosen to, to underline the generational perspective in my contribution tomorrow, because I think it's connected to the idea of temporality in the pandemic crisis, because generation is a concept, that offers us the possibility to analyze social tempo, temporality, and not simply time. Okay, thank you.
There is another question for Geoffrey. If Valérie Leray would like to pose by herself. Okay, thank you.
Hello. So just my question, you mentioned in a quote from Luis Maca that recent struggles are social and epistemic. So I was wondering if we can add to those emerging qualities the ontological aspect of those new struggles as well. Thank you both for your keynote speech.
Please, Geoffrey.
Yes, thank you very much for this all these exchanges and this discussion. I think that I'm very much in line with what Donatella said. Is that first I wouldn't see so many new things in recent social movements. Something are amplified for sure, but also maybe something that were there, but we as social movement scholars, as a community, if we may speak as such, we just oversaw. We didn't pay enough attention to. Solidarity is one of these aspects that haven't been studied enough. It has to be more studied in other subfields like voluntary work or no, voluntary sector, uh, um, civil society from below. And so I think we need to take it back. Lydia also rightly pointed out the fact that progressive movements, well, Castells already spoke about that, and Polanyi and many others. So once again, it's not new. But it helps us. Maybe the pandemic helps us to see some of the points that we may have underestimated, partly. And of course, you will always find some sociologists who wrote about that, always. But maybe it's not sufficiently present in the mainstream social movement studies and our mainstream journals or in the way we consider that. And I totally share Donatella's perspective too on unions. I briefly wrote about it 2 years ago, but unions have been so important again in the pandemic. And this is why also, and we still separate it, as we have solidarity economy on one side and social movements on the other, we also have labor studies, RC44 in ISA, and then social movements. Well, we saw the rise of workfare actions in the US ever since the very beginning of the pandemic, with people uniting, creating new unions in Google, in Amazon's, in many other fields. And they said, well, in the pandemic, it is different because we feel that citizens care for us. We are somehow connected in different way with other human beings. That's what, to take a quote by Amazonian United, the new unions in Amazon. Also important to see unions, or let's say workfare actions and workfare networks in different ways. In Brazil, they managed to reorganize a network of domestic workers. So important during the pandemic because these women were so much affected. Many of them were fired during the pandemic, or they had to take many risks. So yes, there's also this dialogue with union and social movement study that is so important today. And to rethink, of course, unions, organizations, notably for less formal workers. On the importance of epistemic struggles, that I think that in my perspective, that's a core of social movements, that social movements are producers of knowledge, and particularly there's this contest, this struggle around different epistemologies, cosmovisions, as we take about by the Latin American movements, cosmology maybe. And in this point, definitely Valerie is very much right. It's also ontologic. It's really totally related to the nature of being, of human being. The pandemic has opened many questions that we all try to close as fast as possible. Also, I talk for myself personally. But during the pandemic, as Rita Segato writes very well in the book, we also have seen our fragility, our vulnerability. That's a condition of human being that we try to hide. We have also tried to hide all people who died from the pandemic, but it was at some point impossible to hide all people, as we like to do in our society. It's also so vulnerability, but not only. If you look at, for instance, indigenous communities, Zapatista and other, they show that the concept of human being is much more based on community. So it doesn't apply to all, maybe in urban context, but still they seeing from these different ontology, they also have a different concept of public health. It's much more, as they say, a common health, not public health. So that's really interesting to see how the pandemic has opened many questions, and how actually the question are not opened by the pandemic. The epistemic struggle is not opened by the pandemic. It's opened by social actors, and I would say mostly, notably at least, social movements that decide, or that try to take this pandemic as an opportunity to reframe it in a way that it raises these ontological and epistemic questions. It's not the pandemic as such. It's social actors, because other actors have interpreted the pandemic in a very different way. So that's something that at least we may discuss. The fact we may have some doubt that social movement managed to change the world totally, that we are not in super welfare state today. Of course we are not. But on the epistemic side, they probably have been quite efficient in some ways.
Okay, thank you. Barry Percy Smith raised the hand to speak.
Yeah, thanks. I was just conscious that maybe time was moving on and you needed to have a break, but I was yeah, no, I appreciated the presentations from Jeffrey and Donatella and some of the provocations that came out of that. People and really to sort of pick up on some of the ideas that were already being shared. And people talking about I think the social and the epistemic and I think there's and also the ontological. I think there's something here that I'm thinking about in terms of the methodological. And so often as academics, we don't. Well, we're slow to reinvent ourselves in the way we work, and I think I know it's kind of inherent in the whole notion of kind of grassroots movements and social movements. But I think the invitations that we've had to think about. Kind of new values, new thinking that perhaps we need to or movements cohere around. And the idea, I think, Jeffrey, you talked about, I can't remember what word you used, something about visualizing or something, or visualization. And I'm thinking about, you know, the role of social movements in not just contesting status quos, but, you know, that process of rebuilding. And how does this challenge us as well as academics to think about, as we're kind of generating new perspectives, new knowledge, how does this challenge us in how we work and how we kind of get the conversations out of the academy and into everyday lives? And someone talked about the importance of modesty and the importance of everyday practices. I think it's really just an invitation for us to be thinking about that, and how do we think of the methodological elements to this work in ways that make it more accessible to everyday people in everyday lives, rather than just a kind of a professional, educated academic debate. So it's really a provocation, I suppose, just to share.
We are a little bit late in our timing, but if Sahu is ready, he want to speak now, he can speak now. Okay, if Donatella and Geoffrey have no reply, so we close this session. And if Camillo, and very thanks to be here, and very thanks to accept our invitation. And if Camillo agree, we can meet again in 10 minutes, just the time to have a coffee.
Yeah, that will be great. So let's reconvene in 10 minutes. So 35 minutes. Sorry, 10:35 in 10 minutes. And thank you, Donatella and Geoffrey, for your first KeyNote speakers. That was really interesting. So see you in 10 minutes for the first session.
See you later.
Thank you again.
Okay, bye.
Thank you.
Okay, bye. Bye-bye.